All right, students, welcome back. We are now on 12.5. We're going to talk about the economy of the South. Now, this is a shorter PowerPoint. Hopefully it doesn't take us too long this time. I know I keep saying that, but we'll try to keep it under 15 minutes. All right, so let's just jump right into it, okay? So one of the things is we want to understand is what encompasses the South. Now, we go from the 13 colonies, it's something we learn about, then into the 13 states, and then we look at that and we go, oh, that's the South. Well, again, we look at an expansive view going forward. And we break this down because this is what's going to delineate and create the lines when we get to the Civil War. So it's best to understand what states make up the South and what states are what are called slave states later on. So in the 1800s, those are just simple Virginia, Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. But by the 1850, it really expands out and it adds Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And then there's going to be more states added in as the expansion of the United States continues westward. And there's going to be conflict as to what is the South and what is not the South, or what are slave states. And that's going to be a lot of different compromises are going to be made and different things are going to be broken. And this creates a lot of stress within the country itself. But these are the states that we want to focus on just this time around. So let's talk about our 7 factors. First and foremost, labor. Okay, in the 1800s, when we start off, we have about 2 million whites and 1 million black slaves in the South. Now, by the time 1850 hits, there's 7.5 million whites and 3.5 million blacks, which almost every single one of them are under some form of bondage by the white owners. So as you can see, there's quite a few people that are engaged in human servitude during this time frame. Now in 1808, technically the slave trade was ruled illegal and slave ships were not supposed to come anymore and drop off human cargo. However, there was numerous smugglers that were coming in and out who would smuggle slaves in. However, a vast majority of the increase when it comes to slaves in the United States comes through natural procreation. Basically, they have children. And again, though, with the slaves being slaves for life, any children that are born to them, those children are born into servitude. They have no freedom when they are born. Remember, when we look at some of the Supreme Court rulings that we've discussed, African Americans are ruled as being property, not people. That's how they justify having children immediately moved into servitude and into slavery. So there is not an expansive slave trade. There's smuggling, but for the most part, a lot of slave increase comes through natural childbirth. Most laborers, when we look at them, pretty much anybody that's working a farm, that's actually getting in there and doing the hard work, it's either going to be an African-American slave or it's going to be one of the poor white farmers. One of the key things that I try to talk about and discuss is when we look at slave ownership, it never really gets above about a third of all the white population in the South. Now, remember, when we talked about this earlier, I talked to you guys about how they kept the other 2/3 of the whites engaged in the in allowing slavery to exist in the South. And that comes down to them being treated just one hair above the African American slave, and also the the promotion of the idea of being a wage slave. Whereas if you're in the South and you own your own farm, then you are going to be able to one day own your own slaves so you can live the large plantation life that everybody else is around them. However, the ability for virtually most of the poor lower end farmers, that was not a reality. They were just going to be stuck where they were at pretty much for the rest of their lives, because most of the plantation owners have already established the large plantations and taken up the best part of the property and would be able to purchase or force out anybody that was not as economically successful as they were. All right. What about natural resources? Well, again, when we were talking about the colonies, we looked at the South and we looked at them being tobacco growers, indigo, rice, And then they start to move distinctly into cotton. Now, some of those other products are still being grown in the South, but cotton is by far the most profitable and productive for the farms in the South. So it becomes known as what we call in history, and what you look around and you see in historical literature, they call it King Cotton. And so we're going to refer to King Cotton a few times when we look at disparities between economics of the North and the South, and how the South tries to leverage the cotton trade to their benefit. So for the most part, the South is not engaged in mining activities, although there are vast resources of cotton and a few other coal. That's what I meant to say. Coal that they could mine out, and other materials that would be available to them down in the locations. But since cotton was so profitable, there was no reason to exploit the rest of the natural resources. So having farm fields is key to the economic development of the South. All right. Equipment and tools. One of the things that we've talked about and we've looked at is the cotton gin. Remember, the cotton gin changes how much cotton can be produced at any given time. When we looked at the early slaves who had to pick out the seeds, we were looking anywhere from 1 to 5 pounds every day, where once the cotton gin kicks up, we're looking at 50 plus pounds per day that they could produce and have go through the cotton gin. So one of the other things too is that with purchasing a slave and then having a slave engage in natural increase, you engage in just not needing additional farm labor. So if you have slaves and they are having children, you have a continuous cycle of workers that you can exploit and not have to pay. Now, admittedly, you would have to pay for their housing, their food, and their clothing, but for the most part, most slaves were not overly well treated in those categories. So for the plantation owner, to them, it was a minimal expense that they would get for free labor in return. So one of the things is that they look at, they're going, why do I need any employees? This is going to be a system that will continue to work and develop for us. So one of the things that they lack then, because again, King Cotton is down around there, they don't really industrialize all that much. Now, there is industry in the South, but it's pretty small. And when we talk about the Civil War and we look at industrialization, and because of the lack thereof, it puts the South at a distinct disadvantage going into the war. And this, again, comes all about because of King Cotton. All right, transportation. Transportation in the South is mainly done by slow-moving rivers. They would load their cotton up onto barges and other ships and steamboats at this point, and they would push it out to the coast, where then they would load it up into large ships and either ship it up north or over into England, where it would then be turned into a textile. So a vast majority of how things moved was by waterway. There were roads, but they were not necessarily large and improved roads like they were doing up in the north. And rail lines were slow to develop in the South. There were some rail lines, but for the most part, they were not overly developed like up in the north, where they could move vast amounts of resources quickly back and forth because of huge number of rail lines being built and being established throughout the entire northern region. And this plays, again, another key factor when it comes to movement of men, supplies, and material throughout the Civil War. So the South is way behind the curve. And the other problem, again, when we looked at it, their lack of industrialization gives them no ability to produce the advanced steam engines that would be needed during the Civil War. So if they were to lose an engine during the war, they would have no way to replace it, whereas the North has this industrial capacity that they can produce trains continuously and be able to put them back into service. All right, money and credit. Well, cotton, like we said, cotton is king. Tons of money are being produced from it. So banks are more than willing to loan out money to help produce more and more cotton because they knew that they would get a return on their investment. So they were more than willing to loan out vast sums of money. They would get paid money in return in interest payments. However, just like when we talked about earlier in the North, if you had money to back yourself, then typically they'd be more than willing to give you the money in return to grow your profitable crops. If you were a poor white farmer down in the South that was either sharecropping or renting their land, or you had a small farm, typically they're not going to give you the big loans. Again, this is what allows the plantation system to really expand rapidly, where you'd have these vast, huge tracts of land that would be full of cotton, then you'd have a large mansion sitting somewhere near the middle or the fringes of it. And this all comes because of wealth and power of cotton. The more you can produce, the more money you could make. Banks, though, do not necessarily shift to the south. Now, is there some banks in the south? Of course there is. But for the most part, wealth and financial systems are located up in the north. And once again, when we look at these factors, the reason why we talk about them, this again puts the South at an economic disadvantage when the Civil War kicks off. That's why we're talking about these issues, so you can see the difference between the economies. All right. Demand. Of course, cotton's still in demand. You have tobacco and rice, they're in demand, but cotton, again, the most highly demanded product out there. And so they would export the goods, they would export the cottons and cotton and anything that they would need, they would purchase either from the north or from European traders who would come back down, again, stunting their development of industrial capability. Because instead of producing goods and selling it within the South, they again were reliant upon the North and England to create manufactured goods that they could have down in the South. But they did have immense buying power because they made a huge profit on cotton on a continuous basis. All right, again, profit, we just talked about. Cotton on plantation, very profitable. So one of the things, though, is the poor people, they weren't able to produce enough cotton, or they were relegated to growing other crops, and they were not able to get themselves out of an impoverished situation. So wealth was kind of concentrated near the top, while the rest of the South was kind of poor and destitute in numerous locations. All right, so in the development of the South, we would look at a couple things. The two things that were necessary for the development in the South. Now, these are the two key things: slave labor and land for more plantations. Slave labor allowed that vast tracts of land to be farmed at a relatively cheap price comparative to if you had to hire wage laborers to go out there and do the work. And again, it's hard, brutal work too, so it would have been hard anyways to find a lot of laborers that would be willing to go out and pick that cotton no matter what. So that's why for the white plantation owners, that's why they relied upon the slave labor itself, because trying to pull men in from the outer regions was going to be a hard task for them. Eventually, it would have balanced out no matter what. Some historians look at it and they believe that slavery would have naturally come to an end in the United States. However, there's a lot of dispute about that too. I mean, you're talking about an era where the British Empire had finally ended the slave trade throughout most of the world in and of itself. They had spent huge sums of money in order to pay reparations towards the slave owners that had slaves that were now free. So Europe was already pushing towards abolition completely, and people felt that it would only be a matter of time before it would happen in the United States. What do I think? I don't know, because it's all hypothetical. So, however, slavery becomes one of the largest issues in the American history, and it does lead to our large Civil War. Okay, well, that ends this unit right here. Make sure you do the bell ringer and that you go ahead and accomplish the quiz/homework. On Friday, we are probably going to move on to a project right before spring break. It'll be a small project. We're not going to give you anything that's going to last over your spring break period, because trying to do a review and then spending that entire time is not going to help you when it comes time to take the test. We'll probably do a massive review when you guys come back from spring break. All right, guys, we will meet up again tomorrow.